Can you imagine waking up every morning in a place that feels both familiar and terrifyingly alien? It was July 14, 1944, 600 hours. The sun was just beginning to paint the Texas sky with streaks of orange and pink as the first rays of light touched Camp Hereford. Dust devils danced across the parched earth, a constant reminder of the unrelenting heat that would soon bake the landscape. You could almost feel the dry air crackling with tension, a palpable weight that settled upon the rows of barbed wire and the watchtowers manned by vigilant American guards. Inside, the German prisoners of war stirred, their faces etched with a mixture of resignation and simmering defiance. Sergeant Miller, a veteran of the North African campaign, patrolled the perimeter, his gaze sweeping across the compound. He knew these men. He had seen their faces on the battlefield, heard their guttural shouts in the heat of combat. Now they were here behind barbed wire, their war seemingly over. But Miller, a man hardened by experience, knew that war never truly ended, it just changed form. The routine at Camp Hereford was as predictable as the sunrise. Reveille, breakfast, work details, meager rations, and then the long, sweltering hours until nightfall. It was a monotonous cycle designed to break the spirit, to grind down resistance. But beneath the surface of this carefully constructed order, something was stirring. It started subtly. A whispered conversation in the mess hall, a furtive glance exchanged during work detail, an air of anticipation that seemed to hang heavy in the air. Miller couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt it, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck that warned him something was amiss. One morning, Private Johnson, a fresh-faced kid barely out of boot camp, was assigned to mess duty. He was tasked with serving the morning beverage, a new addition to the prisoners' breakfast, concentrated frozen orange juice reconstituted with water. It was a small luxury, a gesture of goodwill intended to boost morale, but it had an unexpected effect. As Johnson ladled the pale orange liquid into metal cups, he noticed a strange reaction among the prisoners. Some recoiled, their faces contorted in disgust. Others stared at the drink with suspicion, as if it contained poison. A few tentatively took a sip, their eyes widening in surprise before quickly masking their emotions. One prisoner, a burly man with a scar that ran across his left cheek, refused to take the juice altogether. His name was Hauptmann Captain Hoffman, a decorated officer known for his unyielding discipline and unwavering loyalty to the Reich. He simply stared at the cup, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with a barely suppressed rage. Johnson, unnerved by Hoffman's reaction, reported the incident to Sergeant Miller. "Sergeant," he stammered, "the Krauts don't like the orange juice. Especially that officer Hoffman, he looked like he wanted to kill me." Miller frowned. It was just orange juice, a simple drink. Why would it elicit such a strong reaction? He decided to investigate. The next morning, Miller observed the breakfast service himself. He watched as the prisoners filed through the line, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as they approached the orange juice. He focused on Hoffman, who again refused the drink, his eyes locked on Miller's with a defiant glare. After breakfast, Miller approached Hoffman. "Hauptmann," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "is there a problem with the orange juice?" Hoffman hesitated for a moment, then responded in perfect English. "The juice is unfamiliar, Sergeant. We are not accustomed to such things." "It's just orange juice, Hauptmann," Miller replied. "A source of vitamin C, it's good for you." Hoffman's lips curled into a sardonic smile. "Is it, Sergeant, or is it something more?" Miller stared at Hoffman, trying to decipher his meaning. Was he implying that the juice was poisoned, or was there something else, something deeper, that he wasn't saying? That night, Miller couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He kept replaying the conversation with Hoffman in his mind, searching for a clue, a hidden meaning. He decided to dig deeper. He started by researching the history of concentrated orange juice. He learned that its development had been accelerated by the war effort as a way to provide essential nutrients to soldiers on the front lines. It was a quintessentially American invention, a symbol of the nation's ingenuity and resourcefulness. But why would that bother the prisoners? Why would it elicit such a strong reaction from Hoffman? Miller then turned his attention to Hoffman himself. He reviewed his file, studying his military record, his personal history. He discovered that Hoffman was not just any prisoner. He was a highly decorated officer, a veteran of numerous campaigns, a man known for his intelligence and unwavering loyalty to the Nazi regime. He was also a member of the Abwehr, German military intelligence. The pieces began to fall into place. Miller realized that Hoffman's reaction to the orange juice wasn't about the drink itself, but about what it represented: American ingenuity, American power, American victory. It was a symbol of the crushing defeat that Germany was facing, but that still didn't explain the air of anticipation that Miller had sensed among the prisoners. It didn't explain the whispered conversations, the furtive glances. There was something more, something hidden beneath the surface. Miller decided to intensify his surveillance. He assigned extra guards to monitor the prisoners' movements. He ordered random searches of their barracks. He even tapped the phones of the camp's officers, but he found nothing. The prisoners remained compliant, their behavior seemingly normal. Weeks turned into months, and the mystery of the orange juice faded into the background. Miller began to doubt his instincts. Maybe he was just being paranoid. Maybe he was reading too much into things. Then one cold November evening, a routine inspection of the camp's kitchen uncovered something extraordinary. A cook, a portly man named Sergeant Reynolds, stumbled upon a hidden compartment behind the pantry. Inside, he found a meticulously crafted radio transmitter, disguised as a stack of orange juice concentrate cans. Reynolds immediately reported the discovery to Miller, who rushed to the kitchen. He stared at the transmitter in disbelief. It was a sophisticated piece of equipment, capable of sending and receiving messages over long distances. Miller knew immediately that this was the missing piece of the puzzle. The prisoners weren't just reacting to the orange juice, they were using it as a cover for something much more sinister. They were using it to communicate with the outside world, but who were they communicating with? And what were they saying? Miller ordered a full-scale investigation. He interrogated the prisoners, he scoured their barracks, he reviewed every piece of evidence he could find. But the prisoners remained tight-lipped, refusing to divulge any information. The investigation stalled, and Miller found himself back at square one. He knew that the prisoners were up to something, but he couldn't prove it. He couldn't break their code of silence. He felt a growing sense of frustration, a gnawing feeling that he was missing something crucial. He needed a break, a new perspective. He decided to revisit the scene of the crime, the kitchen. He walked through the pantry, examining every shelf, every container. He studied the layout of the room, trying to imagine how the transmitter had been concealed. As he ran his hand along the wall behind the pantry, he noticed something unusual. A small section of the wall felt slightly warmer than the surrounding area. He pressed against it, and to his surprise, a section of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden passage. Miller drew his pistol and cautiously entered the passage. It was narrow and dark, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. He followed it for what seemed like an eternity, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, the passage opened into a small, underground chamber. The chamber was dimly lit by a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the chamber, Miller saw something that made his blood run cold. It was a map. A detailed map of Camp Hereford with several key locations marked with red circles. And at the center of the map, a large X marked the spot directly beneath the general's quarters. Miller's mind raced. What were the prisoners planning? Were they plotting an escape, or were they planning something much worse? He noticed something else in the chamber. A small wooden box sitting on a table next to the map. He cautiously approached the box and opened it. Inside, he found a diary. A leather-bound diary filled with meticulous handwriting in German. He recognized the handwriting as belonging to Hauptmann Hoffmann. Miller knew that this diary held the key to unlocking the mystery. He carefully removed the diary from the box and began to read. The diary entries were cryptic and coded, filled with references to obscure historical events and philosophical concepts. But as Miller continued to read, a pattern began to emerge. He realized that the diary wasn't just a personal journal, it was a record of a secret plan. A plan so audacious, so dangerous that it could have devastating consequences. The prisoners weren't planning an escape. They weren't just trying to disrupt the camp. They were planning something much bigger. They were planning to assassinate General Patton. The diary revealed that Hoffman and his fellow prisoners were part of a secret Nazi cell tasked with eliminating key Allied leaders. They had been using the radio transmitter to communicate with their contacts in South America, who were providing them with instructions and resources. The orange juice, Miller realized, was more than just a cover. It was a symbol of American weakness, a reminder of the cultural and ideological divide that separated the prisoners from their captors. It was a way for them to maintain their sense of identity and purpose, even in the face of defeat. Miller knew that he had to act quickly. He couldn't let the prisoners carry out their plan. He had to stop them before it was too late. He closed the diary and carefully placed it back in the box. He turned to leave the chamber, but as he did, he noticed something else, a small, almost invisible inscription on the bottom of the box. He bent down to get a closer look. The inscription was a single word written in Latin, Carthago. Miller's blood ran cold. Carthago, Carthage, the ancient city that had been destroyed by Rome. He suddenly understood the true scope of the prisoners' plan. They weren't just planning to assassinate General Patton. They were planning to destroy Camp Hereford. They were planning to unleash a wave of chaos and destruction that would reverberate throughout the American war effort. But how? How could they possibly destroy an entire camp? He remembered the map. The map with the X marking the spot directly beneath the general's quarters. He suddenly understood where the tunnel led. It wasn't out of the camp. It was under the general's quarters, and they weren't just digging a tunnel. They were planting explosives. Content. Miller stumbled back out of the hidden passage, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He sealed the entrance as best he could, his mind already racing. He couldn't trust anyone, not yet. He needed to verify everything to understand the full scope of the prisoner's plan before alerting the higher-ups. The risk was too great. Premature exposure could jeopardize everything. The first thing was the explosives. He had to find them, disarm them, and determine how close they were to detonation. He couldn't simply order a search that would alert Hoffman and his co-conspirators. He needed a way to discreetly inspect the area beneath the general's quarters. He decided to use the guise of a routine maintenance check. He approached the camp engineer, a gruff but reliable man named Kowalski, and explained that he had received reports of structural instability in the foundation of the general's building. Kowalski, ever the diligent professional, immediately agreed to conduct a thorough inspection. As Kowalski prepared his equipment, Miller subtly guided him towards the area indicated on the map. He feigned interest in other parts of the foundation, all the while keeping a close eye on Kowalski's reactions. When they finally reached the spot beneath the general's bedroom, Miller held his breath. Kowalski set to work, drilling small holes into the concrete and inserting a miniature camera to assess the structural integrity. The images that flickered on the screen were grainy and unclear, but Miller could make out the telltale signs of tampering. There, nestled within the foundation, were several packages wrapped in burlap sacks. "What do you think, Kowalski?" Miller asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Kowalski frowned. "Something's not right, Sergeant. There are voids in the concrete and these packages, they're interfering with the structural integrity. We need to investigate further." Miller nodded, relieved that Kowalski had confirmed his suspicions. "All right, Kowalski, let's proceed with caution. I'll alert the bomb disposal unit." As Kowalski continued his work, Miller slipped away to contact the bomb disposal team stationed at a nearby military base. He explained the situation, emphasizing the need for absolute secrecy. Within the hour, a team of experts arrived at Camp Hereford, disguised as construction workers. Under the cover of darkness, the bomb disposal team carefully extracted the packages from the foundation. They were indeed explosives, a highly volatile compound known as plastique, enough to level the entire building. Each package was equipped with a timer set to detonate within the next 24 hours. Miller watched as the team disarmed the explosives, his heart pounding in his chest. They had narrowly averted a catastrophe, but the danger was far from over. They had only uncovered one piece of the puzzle. He returned to his office and spread out the map on his desk. He studied the red circles, each marking a strategic location within the camp. He realized that the prisoners' plan was more complex than he had initially imagined. They weren't just targeting the general. They were planning a coordinated attack on multiple targets, including the armory, the communications center, and the main gate. He looked again at the word on the box, Carthago. Why Carthage? Then it struck him. Carthage was utterly destroyed, razed to the ground, and salted to prevent rebuilding. They weren't just planning an attack, they were planning total annihilation. He needed to find Hoffman to confront him to extract the information he needed to stop the prisoner's plan. But Hoffman was nowhere to be found. He ordered a camp-wide lockdown, a complete search of every building and every prisoner. But Hoffman had vanished without a trace. It was as if he had simply disappeared into thin air. Panic began to set in. Where could he be? How could he have escaped detection? Miller realized that Hoffman must have had help, someone within the camp who was aiding and abetting his plan. His mind raced, trying to identify potential collaborators. Could it be one of the guards, a fellow officer, or perhaps one of the civilians who worked on the base? His eyes fell on the file for the camp nurses. One name caught his eye, Nurse Greta Schmidt. Greta was a recent transfer to Camp Hereford, a young woman with piercing blue eyes and a quiet demeanor. She had arrived just weeks before the discovery of the radio transmitter, and Miller had paid her little attention. But now, something about her seemed suspicious. He pulled her file and reviewed her background. She was a German immigrant born in Berlin and raised in Argentina. She had come to the United States shortly before the war, claiming to be fleeing the Nazi regime. But Miller wondered if that was the truth. He decided to bring her in for questioning. He ordered 2 guards to escort her to his office. As they led her into the room, Miller studied her face. She seemed calm, almost serene. There was no sign of guilt or fear in her eyes. "Nurse Schmidt," Miller began, his voice firm but polite. "Thank you for coming in. We just have a few questions for you." Greta nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Of course, Sergeant, I'm happy to cooperate." Miller proceeded with his questioning, asking her about her background, her reasons for coming to America, her experiences at Camp Hereford. Greta answered his questions calmly and confidently, providing detailed and consistent answers, but Miller wasn't convinced. He sensed that she was hiding something. He decided to change his tactics. "Nurse Schmidt," he said, leaning forward, "we found a radio transmitter in the prisoner's kitchen. We believe they were using it to communicate with someone on the outside." Greta's expression remained unchanged. "That's terrible," she said softly. "Who would do such a thing?" Miller continued. "We also found a map, Nurse Schmidt, a map of Camp Hereford with several key locations marked, and we found a diary belonging to Hauptmann Hoffman." He paused, watching her closely. "In that diary, we found a reference to a plan to destroy Camp Hereford." Greta's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent. Miller pressed on. "We believe that you may have information about this plan, Nurse Schmidt. We believe that you may be helping the prisoners." Greta shook her head vehemently. "That's not true, Sergeant. I would never do anything to harm this camp." Miller stood up and walked towards her, his voice low and menacing. "Don't lie to me, Nurse Schmidt. We know about your past. We know about your connections to Germany." Greta's composure finally cracked. Her eyes filled with tears and her hands began to tremble. "Please, Sergeant," she whispered, "I can explain." Miller waited patiently, his gaze fixed on her. Greta took a deep breath and began to speak. She told him about her childhood in Berlin, her family's involvement with the Nazi Party, her own conflicted feelings about the regime. She explained that she had come to America to escape the darkness of her past, to start a new life, but Miller remained skeptical. He didn't believe that she had completely severed her ties to the Nazi ideology. He suspected that she was still loyal to the Reich, that she was still working to undermine the Allied war effort. He decided to confront her with his suspicions. "Nurse Schmidt," he said, "we know that you've been communicating with Hauptmann Hoffman. We know that you've been helping him with his plan." Greta gasped, her eyes wide with fear. "That's not true," she protested. I haven't spoken to Hoffman since he arrived at the camp. Miller raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Because we have evidence to suggest otherwise. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and handed it to Greta. Do you recognize this, Nurse Schmidt? He asked. Greta stared at the paper, her face pale. It was a note written in German, a note that contained a coded message. Where did you get this? She stammered. We found it in Hoffman's cell, Miller replied. It's addressed to you, Nurse Schmidt. It seems that you and Hoffman have been working together for quite some time. Greta remained silent, her eyes fixed on the note. Miller could see that she was trapped. She had been exposed. All right, Nurse Schmidt, he said, his voice softening slightly. I'm willing to make a deal with you. If you tell me everything you know about Hoffman's plan, I'll recommend leniency when it comes time for your trial. Greta hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, Sergeant, she said, I'll tell you everything. She proceeded to tell Miller about Hoffman's plan, about the network of Nazi agents operating within the camp, about the explosives that had been planted beneath the general's quarters. She revealed the names of the other prisoners who were involved, and she provided details about their communication methods. Miller listened intently, his mind racing. He realized that the prisoners' plan was even more elaborate and dangerous than he had initially thought. They were not just planning to destroy Camp Hereford, they were planning to spark a rebellion among the prisoners, to create chaos and confusion that would allow them to escape and rejoin the German war effort. As Greta finished her confession, Miller felt a sense of relief. They had finally uncovered the truth. They had finally exposed the prisoner's plan, but he also felt a sense of unease. Something still didn't add up. There was something that Greta was leaving out. He decided to press her further. Nurse Schmidt, he said, is there anything else you want to tell me? Anything at all? Greta hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. No, Sergeant, she said, that's everything. Miller stared at her intently, trying to decipher her expression. He could see that she was still holding something back. Nurse Schmidt, he said, his voice low and menacing, I know you're lying to me. I know that there's something else you're not telling me. Greta's eyes widened with fear. She began to tremble. Please, Sergeant, she whispered, I've told you everything I know. Miller stood up and walked towards her, his face inches from hers. Don't lie to me, Nurse Schmidt, he said. I know you're protecting someone. Who is it? Greta closed her eyes and took a deep breath. All right, Sergeant, she said, I'll tell you the truth, but you have to promise me that you won't hurt him. Miller raised an eyebrow. Who are you protecting, Nurse Schmidt? He asked again. Greta opened her eyes and looked at him, her face filled with pain and regret. Protecting my brother, Sergeant, she said. Hoffman is my brother. Miller stared at her in disbelief. Hoffman was her brother. That explained everything. It explained why she had been so willing to help him, why she had been so reluctant to betray him, but it also raised a new set of questions. What was Hoffman's true plan? What was the significance of the word Carthago? And what role was Greta playing in all of this? Miller decided to confront Greta with his suspicions about the word Carthago. Nurse Schmidt, he said, what does the word Carthago mean to you? Greta's face paled. She looked away, avoiding his gaze. I don't know what you're talking about, Sergeant, she stammered. Miller pressed on. Don't play coy with me, Nurse Schmidt. I know that you know what it means. It's a code word, isn't it? A code word for something terrible. Greta remained silent, her lips tightly sealed. Miller leaned closer, his voice low and menacing. Tell me, Nurse Schmidt, he said. What does Carthago mean? Greta finally broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered the truth. Carthago is the signal, she sobbed. The signal to detonate the secondary explosives. Miller's blood ran cold. Secondary explosives? What secondary explosives? What are you talking about? He demanded. What secondary explosives? Greta explained that Hoffman and his co-conspirators had planted a second set of explosives throughout the camp, hidden in strategic locations. These explosives were designed to be detonated remotely on Hoffman's signal. Where are they? Miller demanded. Where are the secondary explosives? Greta hesitated for a moment, then revealed the locations of the secondary explosives. They were hidden in the mess hall, the hospital, and the barracks. They were designed to cause maximum damage and chaos. Miller realized that they were running out of time. Hoffman could detonate the secondary explosives at any moment. He had to find him, and he had to find him now. He ordered a renewed search of the camp, focusing on the areas where the secondary explosives were hidden. He mobilized every available guard, every available resource. The race was on. As the search intensified, Miller returned to the underground chamber where he had found Hoffman's diary. He wanted to examine the map more closely to see if he had missed any clues. He spread the map out on the table and studied it carefully. He noticed that there was something written on the back of the map. He flipped it over and saw a series of numbers and symbols. He recognized it as a code, a complex, sophisticated code that he had never seen before. He realized that this code held the key to understanding Hoffman's plan. It contained the location of Hoffman's hiding place, the timing of the secondary explosions, and the identity of his contacts on the outside. But how could he decipher it? He needed an expert, someone who was familiar with German military codes. He thought of Colonel Davies, a brilliant cryptographer who was stationed at a nearby military base. He had worked with Davies on several previous occasions, and he knew that Davies was the best man for the job. He immediately contacted Davies and explained the situation. Davies agreed to come to Camp Hereford and help him decipher the code. As Davies worked on the code, Miller continued to oversee the search for Hoffman. He knew that time was running out. He could feel the tension in the air, the sense that something terrible was about to happen. Hours passed and Davies made little progress. The code was incredibly complex and he was struggling to break it. Miller grew increasingly frustrated. Did answers and he needed them now. Finally, after hours of painstaking work, Davies cracked the code. He looked up at Miller, his face pale and drawn. "He deciphered it," he said. "I know where Hoffman is." Miller leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Where is he?" he demanded. Davies hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a hushed voice. "He's here in the camp," he said. "He's hiding in plain sight." Miller frowned. "What do you mean, where in the camp?" Davies pointed to a location on the map. "He's hiding in the chapel," he said. "In the confessional." Miller stared at Davies in disbelief. The chapel, the confessional, it was the last place he would have expected to find Hoffman. He immediately mobilized a team of guards and raced to the chapel. He burst through the doors and found the chapel empty, but then he saw it. The confessional, he cautiously approached the confessional and threw open the door. Inside, he found Hoffman. He was kneeling on the floor, his head bowed in prayer, but he wasn't praying. Holding a detonator, Miller lunged at Hoffman, trying to grab the detonator. But Hoffman was too quick. He raised the detonator and pressed the button. Nothing happened. Miller stared at Hoffman in confusion. Why hadn't the explosives detonated? Hoffman smiled, a cruel, twisted smile. Too late, Sergeant," he said. "The explosives have already been activated." Miller's blood ran cold. What did he mean? Suddenly, the ground began to shake, the lights flickered, and the chapel began to crumble. Miller realized what was happening. Hoffman hadn't activated the secondary explosives. He had activated something much worse. He had activated the primary explosives. The explosives that were buried beneath the camp. The entire camp was about to explode. He grabbed Greta and Davies and dragged them out of the chapel. They ran as fast as they could, trying to escape the impending destruction. But it was too late. The ground erupted in a massive explosion. The entire camp was engulfed in flames. Miller, Greta, and Davies were thrown to the ground, battered and bruised. They watched in horror as Camp Hereford was reduced to rubble. As the dust settled, Miller looked around. He saw bodies scattered everywhere. Buildings were collapsing and fires were raging. Camp Hereford was gone, destroyed, annihilated, and Hoffman was gone too. But as Miller looked at the destruction around him, he realized that something was wrong. Something was missing. He looked at the map again, studying the locations that had been marked with red circles. He realized that one of the locations was still intact, the armory. The armory had not been destroyed, and that meant that Hoffman was still alive. He had faked his death, using the explosion as a cover to escape. But why? What was he planning to do with the weapons in the armory? Miller suddenly realized the truth. Hoffman wasn't planning to escape. He was planning to start a war within the United States. He was planning to arm the remaining prisoners, to incite a rebellion, to create chaos and destruction throughout the country. Miller knew that he had to stop him. He had to stop him before it was too late. He turned to Greta and Davies. "We have to go to the armory," he said. "We have to stop Hoffman." Greta and Davies nodded, their faces grim. They knew what was at stake. They set off towards the armory, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew that they were walking into a trap, but they had no choice. They had to stop Hoffman, even if it meant sacrificing their own lives. As they approached the armory, they could hear the sounds of gunfire and explosions. The prisoners had already begun their rebellion. Miller, Greta, and Davies exchanged glances. They knew that they were facing a desperate situation, but they were determined to fight to the end. They burst through the doors of the armory, weapons drawn. They found Hoffman standing in the center of the room, surrounded by armed prisoners. Too late, Sergeant," Hoffman said, his voice filled with triumph. "The war has already begun." Miller raised his weapon and aimed it at Hoffman. "It's over, Hoffman," he said. "You're finished." Hoffman laughed. "No, Sergeant," he said. "It's just beginning." Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman wearing a nurse's uniform. It was Nurse Schmidt, but it wasn't Greta, it was another nurse. A nurse that Miller had never seen before. She stepped forward and handed Hoffman a weapon. A weapon that Miller recognized immediately. It was a flamethrower. Hoffman grinned. "Now, Sergeant," he said, "let's see who wins this war." He raised the flamethrower and aimed it at Miller, but before he could pull the trigger, the nurse stepped in front of him. She turned to Miller and smiled. "Goodbye, Sergeant," she said. "It's been a pleasure." And then she pulled the trigger. The flamethrower roared to life, engulfing Miller in a torrent of fire. As the flames consumed him, Miller realized the truth. The nurse wasn't helping Hoffman. She was controlling him. She was the mastermind behind the entire plan, and she had just sacrificed Hoffman to eliminate Miller. But why? What was her motive? As Miller's vision faded, he saw the nurse turn to Greta and Davies. She smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "Now," she said, "let's finish this." She raised her weapon and aimed it at Greta and Davies, but before she could pull the trigger, Greta lunged at her. They grappled for the weapon, fighting desperately for control. During the struggle, the nurse's cap fell off, revealing her hair. Her hair was bright red, and on her scalp, Miller saw a tattoo. A symbol that he recognized from Hoffman's diary. It was the symbol of the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi occult society. Miller's eyes widened in horror. He finally understood the truth. This wasn't just a prison break. This wasn't just a rebellion. This was something much bigger, something much more sinister. This was a ritual, a sacrifice, a summoning. The nurse was planning to use the chaos and destruction of Camp Hereford to open a portal to another dimension, a dimension that would unleash unimaginable horrors upon the world. But before Miller could warn Greta and Davies, the flames consumed him completely. Darkness fell and the world went silent. Greta fought with all her might, but the nurse was too strong. She overpowered Greta and knocked her to the ground. Davies tried to help, but the prisoners quickly surrounded him, preventing him from interfering. The nurse raised her weapon and aimed it at Greta's head. "Goodbye, Greta," she said. "Your sacrifice will be remembered." And then she pulled the trigger, but before the bullet could strike Greta, Davies jumped in front of her, taking the bullet himself. He collapsed to the ground dead. The nurse turned to Greta, her eyes filled with rage. "You can't stop me," she said. "The portal will be opened. And there's nothing you can do to prevent it." Greta looked at the nurse, her face filled with determination. "I won't let you do this," she said. "I'll stop you even if it costs me my life," the nurse laughed. "You're just a foolish girl," she said. "You don't understand what's at stake." She raised her weapon again, preparing to kill Greta, but before she could pull the trigger, Greta saw something on the floor, something that the nurse had dropped during the struggle. It was Hoffman's diary. Greta grabbed the diary and opened it. She flipped through the pages, searching for something, and then she found it, a passage written in code, a code that she recognized. It was the code to disarm the ritual. Greta began to recite the code, her voice trembling. The nurse stared at her in disbelief. "No," she screamed. "You can't do that. You'll ruin everything." But Greta continued to recite the code, her voice growing louder and stronger. As she spoke the final words, the ground began to shake. The sky turned black and a swirling vortex opened above the armory. The prisoners screamed in terror. The nurse shrieked in fury, and then the vortex collapsed. The sky returned to normal and the ground stopped shaking. The ritual had been averted. The portal had been closed, but the danger was far from over. The nurse was still alive, and she was still determined to carry out her plan. She turned to Greta, her eyes filled with hatred. "You haven't won," she said. "This is just the beginning. I will find another way to open the portal, and when I do, there will be no one to stop me." She disappeared into the shadows, leaving Greta alone in the ruined armory. Greta looked around at the destruction. She saw the bodies of the dead prisoners, the shattered weapons, the smoldering remains of Camp Hereford. She knew that she had prevented a catastrophe, but she also knew that the war was far from over. The forces of darkness were still out there, lurking in the shadows. And they would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. Greta closed Hoffman's diary. On the final page, scrawled in desperate handwriting, was a list of names, each followed by a single chilling word: killed. The first name on the list sent a shiver down her spine. It was her own.